I felt a shiver run down my spine when she entered the room. It wasn't the cold air conditioning or the dim light flickering against the evening sky outside. It was her presence. I'd always known her to be warm, loving, and full of life. But today there was something different, something almost unspoken between us. "Hey, Mom," I greeted, trying to keep my voice casual, masking the uncertainty brewing inside me. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch the news, but my mind was elsewhere, lingering on the moment our hands had brushed together earlier in the kitchen. It had felt like an accident, but the way her eyes darted to mine and then quickly away had told a different story. It left me unsettled, like the rules had changed without me realizing it. She didn't respond right away, just stood there for a moment, holding a glass of wine, her eyes soft but distant. I couldn't help but notice how the light caught her hair, making her seem ethereal, almost like she didn't belong to this moment, this place. She looked at me, finally, and there was something in her gaze that I couldn't decipher. Tenderness mixed with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "Can I sit?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. "Of course," I said, shifting to make room for her. I tried to ignore the fluttering in my chest, telling myself I was overthinking things. But when she sat down, the cushion dipped closer, bringing her nearer to me than I was prepared for. The faint scent of her perfume enveloped me, familiar yet intoxicating, and I felt my pulse quicken. We sat there in silence for a moment, the kind that isn't uncomfortable but heavy, laden with words we weren't saying. I could feel her looking at me, and when I finally turned to meet her gaze, I found myself lost in her eyes. They were filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Something deep, something raw. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the tension in the room. It was the kind of question loaded with meaning, the kind that asked more than just the words spoken. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" she pressed, leaning a little closer, her gaze never leaving mine. I noticed the way her lips parted, like she wanted to say more but was holding back. I could feel the heat of her body, the warmth radiating off her in a way that made me feel dizzy. "Nothing," I replied too quickly. "Just stuff." Her hand moved before I could react, resting gently on my knee. It was a small gesture, one she'd done 1,000 times before, but today it felt different. The touch lingered, her fingers curling slightly as if she didn't want to let go. I looked down at her hand, then back up at her, and the look in her eyes had changed. It was softer, almost vulnerable. "Mom," I began, but she silenced me with a shake of her head, her eyes closing briefly as if she was fighting an internal battle. "Do you remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when you were little, and you'd come running to me every time you had a bad dream? You'd curl up next to me, and I'd hold you until you fell asleep." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The memory was vivid, a simpler time when things were uncomplicated, when love was pure and innocent. "I miss those days," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I miss how close we used to be." "We're still close," I insisted, but the words felt hollow, even to me. "Are we?" she asked, and there was a hint of a challenge in her tone now, something desperate and aching. Her hand squeezed my knee, just a little, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't pretend that what I was feeling was just in my head. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized then that the line between us had blurred. Somewhere along the way it had happened without either of us noticing, or maybe we had noticed but we were too afraid to acknowledge it. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What are we doing?" Her breath hitched, and she pulled her hand away like she'd been burned. But the look on her face was one of pain, not regret. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't seem to stop it." Neither could I, apparently. I reached for her hand before I realized what I was doing, threading my fingers through hers. It felt right and wrong all at once, a tangle of emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. "This is dangerous," I said, my voice trembling. "We shouldn't." "I know," she cut me off, squeezing my hand tighter, her eyes pleading with me. But tell me you haven't felt it too. Tell me you haven't noticed the way things have changed. I couldn't lie to her, not about this. I nodded slowly, the admission hanging between us like a dark cloud. I've noticed, I confessed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I just didn't want to believe it. She looked down, her thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Maybe it's just because we've been spending so much time together lately, she offered, almost like she was trying to convince herself. Maybe it's nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like everything. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff and she was the only thing keeping me from falling. What do we do now? I asked, my voice breaking. Her eyes met mine, and the pain in them was unbearable. I don't know, she whispered. I really don't know. We sat there, holding on to each other like lifelines, both of us too afraid to let go but too terrified to take the next step. The room felt suffocating, the silence oppressive, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I couldn't let go of her hand. We can't go back, I realized, the truth hitting me like a punch to the gut. We've already crossed the line. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted this to happen, neither did I. But it had happened, and there was no turning back now. The front door creaked open, and we both froze. My father's voice carried down the hallway, familiar and grounding, yet it suddenly felt like an intruder in this fragile moment we had created. Hey, I'm home, he called, his tone cheerful and oblivious. The sound of keys jangling and the rustle of his jacket being hung up was an ordinary, everyday noise, but it felt deafening now, like a warning bell ringing in my ears. My mother jerked her hand away from mine so quickly it was as if she'd been burned. She shot up from the couch, her face a mask of calm composure, but her eyes betrayed her. They were wide and glistening with barely contained panic. I'll go help him, she whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't wait for my response, just turned on her heel and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me sitting there, breathless and hollow. I tried to slow my racing heart, inhaling deeply, but it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I could hear them talking in the kitchen, my father's deep, warm laugh contrasting sharply with the tension suffocating me. I felt like a child again, caught doing something I shouldn't, but this was so much worse. It wasn't some broken vase or a hidden secret. This was something I couldn't simply hide or fix. I stood up slowly, wiping my palms on my jeans as if I could erase the feel of her hand in mine. I needed to pull myself together before I faced him. My father had this way of looking at me, seeing right through any facade, and if he saw even a hint of what had just happened, what I was feeling, I couldn't bear to think about it. I forced myself to walk toward the kitchen, each step feeling like it could be my last before everything crumbled apart. As I rounded the corner, I saw them together. My mother was standing at the counter, her back to me, pouring a glass of wine with a steadiness that belied the storm I knew was raging inside her. My father was unbuttoning his shirt sleeves, rolling them up casually, his face relaxed and full of affection as he looked at her. Hey, kiddo, he greeted me warmly, turning to give me a smile. His eyes crinkled at the corners, the same way mine do when I smile, and the familiarity of it made my stomach twist painfully. Hey, Dad, I managed, forcing a grin that felt like it might crack my face in two. How was your day? He asked, moving closer to the stove where something simmered, the scent of spices filling the air. It should have felt comforting, the usual rhythm of our family evenings, but everything felt tainted now, different in a way I couldn't undo. It was fine, I said, glancing at my mother, who was keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the glass in her hand. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in the way she moved, like she was barely holding herself together. Dinner smells amazing, my father continued, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around us. He stepped behind my mother, placing a hand on her waist as he leaned down to kiss her cheek. She flinched, just a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. And when she looked up at me, for just a second, our eyes met, and I saw the same fear and guilt that I felt mirrored in her gaze. I tore my eyes away, focusing on the floor as if the pattern of the tiles could offer some kind of escape. "You okay?" my father asked, looking between the two of us now, his brow furrowing slightly. He wasn't smiling anymore. There was a flicker of concern in his eyes, that innate ability he had to sense when something wasn't quite right. "Yeah," my mother said quickly, her voice overly bright. "I just spilled some wine earlier, that's all. I'm a bit jumpy." He laughed softly, clearly reassured by her easy excuse. But I wasn't. I could feel the weight of the lie settle between us. Another brick in the wall we were suddenly building without meaning to. "Help me set the table, will you?" my mother asked, her tone a bit too breezy as she handed me a stack of plates. Her fingers brushed against mine as she passed them over, and it felt like a shock of electricity, like a reminder of what had happened only moments before. I nodded, wordlessly taking the plates and turning away before I could betray anything in my expression. As I set the table, I could feel her watching me, the intensity of her gaze like a physical weight pressing down on me. My father, meanwhile, was humming softly, oblivious as he poured himself a drink, completely unaware that the two people he loved most were standing on the edge of a precipice. We sat down for dinner, and the silence was thick, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware against plates. I couldn't look at her, couldn't look at him, so I kept my eyes fixed on the food in front of me, swallowing down bite after bite that felt like it could choke me. "How was work today?" my mother asked him, her voice casual, but I could hear the strain underneath it. "Oh, same old," he replied, launching into a story about a client at the office. I nodded along, not really listening, my thoughts miles away. I kept replaying the moment on the couch over and over, like a loop I couldn't escape from, each time feeling more and more like I was going to be sick. "Are you feeling okay?" my father asked suddenly, looking at me with concern. "You seem distracted." I forced myself to look up at him, to meet his eyes, and the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. He was kind, loving, and completely in the dark about what was happening right under his nose. "Yeah, I'm just tired," I lied, giving him a weak smile. "You should get some rest then," he said, reaching over to squeeze my shoulder affectionately. "You've been working hard." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, maybe I will." As I stood up to leave the table, I felt her eyes on me, a silent plea that I couldn't bring myself to answer. I turned away quickly, muttering something about needing to go to my room. I could feel her gaze burning into my back as I walked away, and I knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I made it to my room and closed the door, leaning against it as I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I felt like I was going to collapse under the weight of it all, the crushing realization that we had stepped over a line that could never be redrawn. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to go back. I stood there, leaning against the door, my forehead pressed to the cool wood as I tried to ground myself. My thoughts were racing, fragments of the evening swirling in my mind. The look in her eyes, the feel of her hand, and the way she had flinched when Dad touched her. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a dream I couldn't wake up from. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it all out. I could hear the muffled sounds of their voices drifting up from the kitchen. My father was talking, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I tried not to listen, but I couldn't help myself. "Everything okay?" I heard him ask her again, softer this time, his voice tinged with genuine concern. Yes, she replied too quickly. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." There was a pause, and I imagined him studying her, trying to see through the mask she was wearing. He knew her so well. How could he not sense that something was off? But then again, maybe he didn't want to see it. Maybe he trusted her too much to even entertain the thought that there could be something wrong between us. I swallowed hard, pushing off the door and moving to the window. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. I opened it, letting the cool night breeze wash over my face. It helped, but only a little. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of everything that had happened. A few minutes passed, and I heard footsteps on the stairs, hers. I tensed, my body reacting instinctively. I didn't want to face her, not now, not yet. But she was coming anyway. There was a soft knock on my door. I knew it was her before she even spoke. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no, to tell her to leave me alone. But I couldn't. I couldn't shut her out, not after everything. So I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and mumbled, "Yeah, come in." The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Part worry, part fear, part something else entirely. The room felt smaller with her in it, the air thick and charged. "Are you okay?" she asked, echoing the same question Dad had asked her. But this time it was filled with a deeper, more personal meaning. I didn't answer right away. I turned back to the window, staring out into the darkness. "What are we doing?" I asked finally, my voice hollow. She took a step closer, but stopped herself, like she wasn't sure if she should. "I don't know," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Her words cut through me like a knife. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I demanded, spinning around to face her. "You keep saying that, but we both know it wasn't just an accident. We crossed a line, and now we're standing here pretending like we don't know what we're feeling." She flinched at the harshness of my tone, her eyes filling with tears she was trying desperately to hold back. "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "I know, and I'm so sorry, but you have to understand, I never wanted this. I love your father. I would never want to hurt him. You already have." I shot back, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "We both have, and he has no idea. He trusts us, Mom." She took a shaky breath, running a hand through her hair. "We have to stop this," she said, more to herself than to me. We can't let this go any further. It's wrong." I laughed bitterly. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel guilty every second I look at him, knowing what's going on between us?" My voice dropped, filled with a raw, aching pain I couldn't hide. "But the worst part is, I don't even want to stop. Do you?" She stared at me, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she took a step closer, and then another, until she was standing right in front of me. So close I could feel the warmth of her body, smell the familiar scent of her perfume. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Her hand reached up, hesitating for just a moment before brushing against my cheek. The touch was featherlight, but it sent a jolt through me, a sensation I couldn't ignore. "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to hurt anyone." I caught her hand in mine, holding it there against my face. "Then why does it feel like you're the only one who sees me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why do I feel like I've been invisible my whole life, except when you look at me like this?" Her breath hitched, and she stepped even closer, her forehead resting against mine. "You're not invisible," she whispered. "You've never been invisible to me." We stood there like that, wrapped in each other, teetering on the edge of something we couldn't control. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like the rest of the world had faded away and it was just us, suspended in this impossible moment. But then we heard it, the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, heavier this time. My father. We pulled apart so quickly it felt like we'd been caught doing something illicit. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, while she wiped a tear away, forcing a smile that looked painfully fake. He appeared in the doorway, a look of mild confusion on his face. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, glancing between the two of us. "Yeah," I said, my voice too loud, too forced. "Just talking." He nodded slowly, his brow furrowed as he looked at us. I could tell he sensed something was off, but he didn't push it. "All right," he said after a moment. "Well, I was going to put on a movie downstairs if you want to join." "I'll be down in a bit," my mother said quickly, giving him a strained smile. He nodded again and disappeared back down the hallway. As soon as he was gone, she turned to me, her face crumpling with an emotion I couldn't bear to see. "This has to end," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't keep doing this." I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to disagree. "I know," I whispered back, "but it's already too late, isn't it?" She didn't respond. She just looked at me one last time, a look filled with so much sadness and longing that it took my breath away, before turning and walking out of the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was left standing there, alone with the unbearable weight of what we had become.